with part two of the document entitled What's Wrong with Fusion Centers? What's wrong with fusion centers? We're talking about fusion centers and what's wrong with them. If you remember in part one, I showed you this map here of the United States of America. All the teal green sections represent states that have fusion centers. The blue section represents states that have fusion centers under development, and the gray represents states that do not have a fusion center. As we look at the document, the table of content is here at the top of the screen here. It starts out with number one, or section one, being ambiguous lines of authority allow for policy shopping. Section two is private sector participation in fusion centers risks privacy and security. Section three is military participation in fusion centers violates fundamental tenets of liberty. Number four is data fusion equals data mining, which is bad for privacy and bad for security. And then finally, number five, or section five, is excessive secrecy undermines the mission of fusion centers. Now, as I begin part two here, I want to look at section one here really quick, and we're just going to do a short overview because I really want to get to the private sector section, which is very important. It says one problem with fusion centers is that they exist in a no man's land between the federal government and the states, where policy and oversight is often uncertain and open to manipulation. There appears to be at least some conscientious effort to circumvent public oversight by obscuring who is really in charge of these fusion centers and what laws apply to them. Now, I want to highlight that part. It says again, I'm going to read it again here. It says there appears to be at least some conscientious effort to circumvent public oversight by obscuring who is really in charge of these fusion centers and what laws apply to them. And all of this is by design, friends, and you're going to see that as we continue the document. What I've noticed the more I study into this is I realize that all of this is kind of playing into the whole idea of following the money trail and finding out who's behind it. When you do that, you realize why things are happening, why things are so secretive, and basically why there seems to be no desire for oversight. It goes on to read, in struggling to answer this seemingly simple question of who is in charge of fusion centers, at a recent congressional hearing, a Department of Homeland Security official could only offer that fusion centers are in charge of fusion centers. Now, I want to make a note of that. A congressional, at a congressional hearing, one Homeland Security official said fusion centers are in charge of fusion centers, and you could see that that's desire to circumvent oversight. One analysis reportedly described his fusion center as the Wild West, where officials were free to use a variety of technologies before politics catches up and limits options. Now, I want to move on to the next section here, policy shopping. Policy shopping, I think that's important that we understand that. Again, I'm just going to deal with the first section under policy shopping here. It says the presence of representatives from federal, state, and local agencies at fusion centers and the ambiguity over who controls them can lead to the practice of policy shopping, in which officials pick and choose from overlapping sets of laws so they can collect and use personal information as freely as possible while avoiding privacy laws, open record acts, and civil liability. And again, that's the reason why fusion centers were created, to kind of circumvent policy laws and open record acts and various other things like civil liability. Some states, for example, have a much stronger privacy or open records laws than the federal government, while in other states they are weaker. Fusion centers can manipulate who owns the records or where they are held to thwart public oversight. Again, I want to underline and kind of make note of this section here. Because again, what we're seeing is sort of a push to kind of circumvent or sort of hide from public oversight. That means that there's a lot of corruption going on. Again, it says fusion centers can manipulate who owns the records and where they are held to thwart public oversight. Now, to keep reading here. If a particular state or locality has unusually broad privacy protection laws, the cooperating authorities can simply arrange for fusion center participants from the jurisdiction that jurisdiction to have access to data without actually hosting it. A Texas Fusion Center analysis description of this scheme was described by a reporter. Of particular interest to many at the meeting was the way the center accesses and uses data from local agencies. It does not host the data, but rather refreshes them regularly. That means analyses are not subject to Freedom of Information Act or being dragged into court. And again, this comes out of Texas. It comes out of their Fusion Center in Texas. It's kind of their policy. All right, I'm going to move to the next section here, this section on federal law. It goes on to read, Title 28 of the Code of Federal Regulation, Part 23, governs what information can be put in a law enforcement database and how it can be used. Now, this is very important as we'll continue. You're going to see that most of the information put in fusion centers are not just used by law enforcement. The regulation states that, on the next page here, criminal intelligence system shall collect information concerning an individual only if there is a reasonable suspicion that the individual is involved in criminal conduct or activity, and the information is relevant to the criminal conduct or activity. And the law limits the dissemination of law enforcement intelligence to situations in which there is a need to know and a right to know the information in the performance of law enforcement activity. As we continue reading here, it says this provision should limit what type of information fusion centers could exchange with non-law enforcement fusion center participants and with each other. Indeed, many fusion center personnel contacted by the ACLU stated emphatically that they complied with this law and that they plan to remain compliant by not incorporating private sector personnel within their fusion centers. CRS even reported that some fusion center personnel were concerned that sharing law enforcement information with DHS, which often employs non-law enforcement contractors, might violate the statute. These law enforcement officers should be commended for their professionalism. Goes on to read, however, it is worrying that the federal guideline report does not account for this law when it advocates for the expanded scope of data to be collected at fusion centers. And indeed, as fusion centers start sharing databases, they appear to be looking for ways to circumvent these regulations. All right. So you can see that there's a push to kind of go beyond collecting data, local data, to collecting data on a federal level. It goes on to say a California Fusion Center representative complained that compliant tasks required to manage law enforcement data sharing regulations require an enormous amount of work, then suggested that by establishing memorandums of understanding with data sharing in mind, they can move data from one database to another without worrying about someone else's data warehouse policies. So you can see it's very clear here that these fusion centers are set up to basically spy on Americans, and they have such a wide range or wide ability to be able to collect data on individuals, and they're swapping data from one fusion center to another, from one organization to another. These individuals that are collecting data, they're not law enforcement, they're basically contractors, and they're handing this data over to individuals so that they can continue surveilling the person. And I want to show you how that factors into this whole surveillance thing under this next section called the private sector participation. All right, guys, here's the section that I really wanted to get through in the entire document. It's entitled the private sector participation. You can tell by that title, private sector participation. That spells gangstalking. Starts out reading, fusion centers are poised to become part of a wide-ranging trend of recent years in the United States, the creation of a surveillance industrial complex in which security agencies and the corporate sector join together in a frenzy of mass information gathering, tracking, and routine surveillance. Now, this is exactly what I've been driving at through this whole document, friends. You're going to see this whole surveillance industrial complex, that is, by definition, gang stalking. You can see also it says security agencies and the corporate sector join together in a frenzy of mass information gathering, tracking, and routine surveillance. Routine surveillance. I mean, let these words sink in, guys. If you really read through just this section alone, you can see very clearly that this spells gang stalking. That's what this is all about. That's what the Fusion Center's purpose is. Surveillance, security agencies coming together, joining with private sector, a mass frenzy of information gathering, tracking, and surveillance. Okay, notice this section here. It says, one of the goals of fusion centers is to protect the nation's critical infrastructure, 85% of which is owned by private interests. And one of the value propositions justifying federal support for fusion centers is increased government access to non-traditional information sources. Now, watch this, guys. The guidelines emphatically encourage fusion centers to invite a wide range of public safety, public works, social service, private sector entities to participate in the fusion process. Now, I want to emphasize this, guys, and I'm going to underline it here because I want you to really listen to these words in this document, how they're describing what I consider to be the gang stalking program. They're talking about inviting a wide range of public safety, public works, social service, and private sector entities. Those are 4 different entities. Again, public safety, public works, number 2, social services, private sector entities. Now, again, guys, you're going to see that these entities represent entities that provide information for the fusion centers. And you can see there at the bottom of the page there, they clearly tell us that these 4 entities they participate in the fusion process. That's the reason why it's called fusion centers, because these 4 entities come together to provide information. On the next page, you can see at the top of the page here, a wide range of information. What type of information? It says a wide range of information there. I want to kind of emphasize that. Wide range of information. Why are they collecting all this information on American people? Well, we can only speculate. They're not telling us. But it becomes obvious when you see who's participating. The DOJ Fusion Center guideline include a 6-page list, which it says is not comprehensive, of potential types of information fusion centers could incorporate. Some of the sources included on the list were private sector entities such as food, water, production facilities, grocery stores, and supermarkets and restaurants, banks, investment firms, credit companies, and government-related financial departments, right? So these are all the entities that's going to provide information on individuals that are being surveilled. Preschool, daycare centers, university, primary and secondary schools, and other educational entities providing information on suspicious activity. Now, if they're providing information on suspicious activity, I mean, who considers it suspicious? Does law enforcement consider it suspicious? Or does the private contractor consider it suspicious? Right? Fire and emergency medical services in both the public and private sector, such as hospitals and private EMS services, utility, electricity, and oil companies, Department of Energy, private physicians, pharmaceutical companies, veterinarians, the gaming industry, sports authority, sporting facilities, amusement parks, cruise lines, hotels, motels, resorts and convention centers, internet service and an email provider or email providers, the FCC telecom companies, computers, software companies, and related government agencies, defense contractors and military entities, the U.S. Postal Service, private shipping companies, apartment facilities, facility management companies. So your apartment facility management company is spying on you. I mean, what kind of information would they provide? Right? They're providing gangstalking. They're perpetrators. Malls, retail stores, shopping centers, state and child welfare entities, government, public, and private transport entities such as airline and shipping companies. Now, again, friends, I mean, this represents information. It's a wide range of information, but it's also a wide range of individuals providing information. And they're providing information. Keep in mind, all of this information is provided to the Fushion Center. And who works in the Fushion Centers? Does law enforcement work there? No. Private contractors work there. They have security clearances. And they're collecting this data. Basically, Americans are spying on Americans. That's what the whole Fushion Center. This is the reason why this is so reminiscing of the COINTEL program. This is exactly what the COINTEL, but this is COINTELPRO on steroids, guys, because they're swapping data from one Fusion Center to the next Fusion Center. It's government funded. And not only that, the government has allowed them, because of their funding, to increase their data collection services to include federal services. So they're not just providing local information, they're providing information on you and I on a federal level. And this information is being housed there. They have vaults, data mining vaults, where they're collecting this data and keeping it for years to come. I mean, this stuff is obviously kept in computers. It's not actually kept in file cabinets, but it's on computers. But fact of the matter is they're collecting this data on each one of us. And this data is being used basically to spy and surveil on people. So I imagine this video is part of the data that's being collected on me, right? But I didn't write this document. This document was written by the ACLU. It's been written back in 2007. I believe it was 2007. And it clearly shows that there is a secretive program going on in the Fusion Centers to collect information, data, and to track and surveil people. And they provide personnel to surveil as well, including perpetrators from all of these different private entities, banks, investment, preschool, daycare centers, educational facilities, utility companies, private physicians, pharmaceutical companies. I mean, all of these individuals, or I should say entities rather, are providing information as well as individuals to track people. So you wonder when you walk into the doctor's office and it seems like they're involved. It's because they are. You walk into the bank and you feel like they're involved. It's because they are. You walk into the supermarket. You're there to shop and to buy food. You're not committing a crime. But you notice how you walk down one aisle and you got somebody following you on that aisle, and then the same person ends up at the checkout stand in front of you, right? And then the checker is checking you out, not checking your items, but checking you. It's because it's all connected, and it's all connected via the Fusion centers. All right, guys, I'm going to end it here. We're going to continue this document at a later time.